Welcome back, class. Today we're looking at section 8.3 and we're using special factors to solve equations. In particular, we are going to be looking at a difference of squares. So what's a difference of squares? Well, the word difference means to subtract. We are subtracting two perfect squares. So an example of a perfect square would be 25 because 5 times 5 is 25. Another example of a perfect square would be 36 because 6 times 6 equals 36. Another example would be 49 because 7 times 7 equals 49. Another example would be 144 because 12 times 12 is 144. So that said, we are taking away two perfect squares. So when you're subtracting two perfect squares and you're asked to factor, you can actually use this shortcut, which is called a difference of squares. So a squared minus b squared, this is the formula. If you break that apart and factor it using the x method, you'll end up with a plus b times a minus b. Here's an example. X squared minus 25. Notice how we're subtracting two perfect squares. X squared is a perfect square because that's x and x. And 25 is a perfect square, so that's 5 and 5. So the factors of x squared minus 25 are x plus 5 times x minus 5. Another example of a difference of squares is 4x squared minus 9. 4 and x squared are perfect squares because 4x squared is 2x and 2x. And 9 is a perfect square because 3 times 3 is 9. That said, the factors are 2x plus 3 times 2x minus 3. So let's look at some actual examples. So in Explain 2, it says factor each difference of squares. So once again, I know that a is a perfect square because what makes x squared is x and x. 49 is a perfect squared because the factors of 49 are 7 and 7. So now let's write out the factors. The formula tells us that a squared minus b squared is equal to a plus b times a minus b. So that said, I know that my factors are going to be identical except for the fact that one will be positive and the other one will be negative. So x times x is going to give us our x squared, and 7 times negative 7 will give us negative 49. And so this is our answer. If it asks us to factor, then that means that we're not solving for x, so we're not using the zero product property. Let's look at part B. We have 49q squared minus 4p squared. This is a perfect square because 49 is 7 times 7. And q squared is a perfect square because q squared is q times q. 4 is a perfect square because 4 is 2 times 2. And p squared is a perfect square because that's p times p. Now class, let's write out the factors. Remember, they're going to look identical, but one's positive and the other one's negative. So the factors of 49, and we've discussed this, it's 7 times 7. What makes q squared? Q times q. 7q times 7q is 49q squared. What makes negative 4p squared? It's going to be 2p and negative 2p. So the factors are 7q plus 2p times 7q minus 2p. Let's look at some more. In this U-try problem, we have x squared minus 144. Once again, it's a difference of squares. We have x squared, which is x times x. And then 144, that's going to be 12 times negative 12. Those are the factors. We can only use this pattern if we're subtracting two perfect squares. If we're not subtracting two perfect squares, then this shortcut is not going to apply. Okay, let's look at part B. We have 81y to the fourth minus 9y squared. This one's a little tricky, but let's check it out. So we know one's positive and the other factor is negative. Okay, class, now what makes 81? That's going to be 9 times 9. 9 times 9 makes 81. What about y to the fourth power? Y to the fourth power is y squared times y squared. Okay, and then we also have negative 9y squared. What are the two numbers that will multiply to negative 9? That's positive 3 and negative 3. And what will make y squared? Y times y. So these are the factors. Okay, moving on. Now let's go ahead and start solving some problems. We have 25x squared minus 1 equals 0. So notice how we have a difference of squares. DOS, difference of squares. We're subtracting two perfect squares. 25 is a perfect square because 5 times 5 is 25. 1 is a perfect square because 1 times 1 is 1. So let's write out the factors. One's positive, the other one's negative. 25 is 5 times 5 is 25. X squared is x times x. Negative 1 is positive 1 times negative 1. So those are our factors. And for this problem, we're asked to solve, which means that we are going to have to use the zero product property. So set each factor equal to 0. We have 5x plus 1 equals 0, and 5x minus 1 equals 0. Okay, class, let's solve. In the first equation, we want to subtract 1 to both sides. We get 5x equals negative 1. Divide by 5, x equals negative 1/5. In our second equation, we have 5x minus 1 equals 0. Add 1 to both sides. We get 5x equals 1. Divide by 5, x equals 1/5. And so our two solutions are x equals negative 1/5 and x equals 1/5.